So we'll introduce our team in just a minute here. And this is actually part one of a two-part series. So we're going to have another one on June 11th, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's so much to talk about here. We want to introduce the first part and the concept and the case behind it. So let me get into it. So our agenda for today, we really want to talk about how did we get here? Why this model and where did this come from in terms of the foundation of the network? And we want to share a draft of this HX maturity model. So in the spirit of design, this is our draft model. We're developing a prototype that we want to invite you to help us do some user testing with. And this is our first big step in that. We've been doing it at a small scale. This is our first more of a mass input on this. So we want to test it and get your feedback and then talk about next steps. That's our very simple agenda for today. So let me talk a little bit about the Leaders Network. As I mentioned at the beginning, we started in 2017. There were just a handful of you who were doing people experience back in 2017. And I remember interviewing my first case studies. I want to do some research to find out what people were doing in this new area of employee experience, as it was called at the time. And the first two people I interviewed were Paul Davies at GE and Nina Maldonado then at ING. And very shortly thereafter, I met Damon at IBM, who was doing some very similar work there with a new team coming in from UX, and also Martijn, who was at his first of three people experience roles. So also going way back, I met Julie Staudenmeyer. Julie and I lived in Ridgefield, Connecticut, outside New York. Julie was working there at Boehringer Ingelheim, and she's an expert in talent management, change management, leadership development, and has been a key part of this team, especially helping in the New York area. And Beth, who had a career in HR and then went back to design school and got a university degree, an undergraduate degree in this field. So that's our team, and we'll introduce you a bit more in a few minutes. But back then, there were just very few of us. So we've expanded to also encompass and invite and welcome people who are in all of these experience domains. So user experience, service design, customer experience. We prefer to call employee experience or people experience human experience of work. So you heard me refer to HX. So when you hear the term HX, I'm really talking about the colleague experience, but emphasizing the human element of that. We have had some local communities that we set up, and we've been meeting the last many years, but also including the last year. Here's some pictures from this last 12 months in New York City. This is April 2nd, last month in New York, for all of our New York colleagues joining us today. This is the group in London in May last year. We met twice in London last year. We also met in Zurich. This was a very snowy evening in December in Zurich, and also in Amsterdam and Paris. So here's our Paris group. We also had a virtual summit where we invited all the experience domains, and we heard from some of the very early pioneers of experience. So Don Norman, who was the first person at Apple and first person globally to have the title user experience, and really is a incredible pioneer in this field. Don Norman and several others. Our goal is really in this community to learn from one another, share the work that we're doing, and try to together shape how this goes, and really try to practice the use of human-centered design and agile ways of working. So, and here's a picture of our speakers in our first summit. We will have another summit this autumn, October 22nd and 23rd. So you have some more information about that in the coming weeks. All right. So if we talk about where we've been and where we're headed, these first experience waves, the people in UX and service design and CX roles, UX and service design has been with us for more than 30 years. Service design is something maybe came into being probably in the mid to late 90s. User experience started in the 80s. So some of these disciplines have been with us for quite a while. And I have a whole spiel of talk about how this all came into being around the development of mass consumer tech products that needed to be designed for new kinds of users. So this way of working has a very solid foundation that has actually been a key driver in global economic growth for the last 3, 4 decades. But around 900,000 people in these first waves. In the last wave, the third wave, is where we sit if we're dealing with the colleague experience, this HX group, HX community. So this is one of the fastest growing sets of roles today in organizations. We have gone from around 50 people in 2017 to over 35,000 people today. If you add 20,000 from analytics and another 75,000 or so doing agile, if LinkedIn is correct, we've got over 130,000 people in this third wave. So, as you might expect, there's some growing pains in a new discipline. And let's talk a little bit about those. So, most of the people doing HX or colleague experience have only been in these roles in the last 3, 4 years. And the overwhelming majority of them have no prior experience. They do not come with the toolkit of user experience, service design, human-centered design methodology. But if you look at the people doing analytics and these other roles that are older, overwhelming percent of them, 80, 90% of these people show university degrees, certifications, training in these roles. So if you look at these two on the left or the right, look at all the skill sets or training or certifications these people have. This is from LinkedIn, from research, talking to people, and this is only a short list, right? So those of you who know this field. So we'd like to see in the HX roles, those of you doing colleague experience, more of these skill sets, more certifications, more university degrees. And these are some of the things we look for in doing some of these skills, right? All right, so that bears out in where we are in maturity levels. So we do a survey every year, and we seem to be kind of stuck in this early stage where most of you are still either researching how to get this skill set and knowledge base into your organization, or you're just getting started. You're starting to do some mapping, et cetera. And there's a lot we have yet to learn. That's really why we're here, is how to address that skill and knowledge gap and help all of you move from this early stage into something that is more meaningful, more impactful with your business. I'm going to turn this over to Julie and our team to introduce the maturity model, but I just want to set this up with what we've heard as the most persistent, consistent questions from all of you over 8 years in these networking meetings, in the workshops and training that we do with dozens of companies around the world. These are the things you're talking about. First of all, you're looking for sponsorship. How do we get support in HR and the business? How do you prove the value of human-centered design? You're also concerned about what is it we're supposed to be measuring and sharing? And when we talk about qualitative insights in human-centered design, how do we prove the value of that? And how are we exactly supposed to go about developing these new capabilities, teach human-centered design as a preferred way of working? And what's our strategy overall? If we take this from a change perspective, how do we do this? So the reason why I chose this team to work on this maturity model several months ago is that I've known these people for the past 8 years. And in these kinds of settings, I've vetted them. I've seen how they work with how they teach, how they coach others. I've introduced them to many people in the network. For many of you, you probably already know many of these coaches. So this is how we got here. And I feel like they're the people who are best prepared to share their knowledge and expertise with all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Elliot. Could you advance to the next beautiful picture that we have to share? This is an overview, folks, of the model. And something you said, Elliot, that I think resonates strongly with all of us is that we are new in this journey or midway in this journey, and we don't have to go it alone. One of the reasons we've developed this model is to give people a sense of how to progress figure out where we are right now and how do we move forward. Like all maturity models, we're going to be moving from left to right, from learning to doing to being, to really embodying a human-centered approach to organizational transformation. Those of you who have been involved in transformation work in the past are going to recognize some of these elements. We're going to talk about how these elements of leadership, capabilities, governance, and strategy show up as you're becoming more human-centered and tying that to your business strategy. And like all business strategies, what we're really after is what you see in the center there, the impact on work and the impact on business. A good thing to remember is that you don't have to wait until you're fully mature to begin to have some impact. I'm going to ask Elliot if you could flip to the next page. And today, just to let everyone know where we're headed, as Elliot said, we're going to have this seminar on learning, and then we'll have a follow-up on doing and being. I'm going to turn to our extraordinary experts on the team, starting with Damon, to talk about what we mean around learning when it pertains to how are we working and how are we seeing results. And then we'll progress down through the rest of the elements with Nina and Martijn's help.
All right, thanks, Julie. So like Elliot and Julie were describing, when we talk about HX, we're talking about intentionally orchestrating, people, processes, and tech using a human-centered design approach, along with those skills and tools and frameworks that have been developed over decades of investing in CX. And so when we take that approach and when we mature our HX capability over time, which is what this model will describe, we can drive tremendous impact to both the experience of work, showcased here in the green lane, but also drive tangible business results. And so that shows up here in the orange lane. And so in the model, number one, when we talk about the impact on work and the experience of work, a dedicated HX leader and team, they can really take the lead in this important transformational shift from a transactional HR organization, but instead to one that delivers like intentional, experience-led design of work. And the result isn't just improved, employee engagement, which I'm guessing many of us here know quite a bit about engagement and have heard about it, but it's really about measuring and moving well beyond engagement. So we're talking about things like increased employee satisfaction, retention, trust is a big one that we're trying to drive more recently. Of course, productivity and advocacy for the organization. And so one thing that is important about these experience of work improvements that we can do is that these are all measurable as well, which is important as you go to mature your practice. Number two, when we talk about like the impact on business, an HX leader and a team can be a strategic and powerful lever for driving business performance. So the ROI of investing in HX from a business impact perspective shows up with things like reduced cost, increased outputs, faster time to value, of course, higher sales and customer satisfaction, and like Elliot mentioned, greater agility and innovation. So it can help really transform an organization's operating model by shifting HR and other corporate functions from being traditional service providers, but instead to like innovative, what I like to call like experience architects and strategic enablers that can drive tangible and impactful outcomes with the business. So we'll get into more specifics about these kinds of impacts here in a few minutes, and I'll share a couple of examples. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Nina, and she can touch on the leadership and the capabilities dimensions that you see here in the middle.
Thank you very much, Damon, and nice to be here and share with everyone. A couple of pillars, there are 4 of those, but a couple of pillars that really drive a sustainable result and impact, as Damon explained, are really focusing on the leadership and the capabilities you're able to build in order to get those results. And when we're talking about leadership, I am someone who usually take the MacGyver style. I start creating a movement everywhere where I go, and then I see if it resonates with people. But believe me, throughout the years, I have learned the importance to have senior leadership sponsorship. It's extremely essential if you want to bring human experience to the next level, because those senior leaders are the ones who are going to first create more awareness, become the role models, but also give you the resources you need. So this is extremely important to consider wherever you are going. If you are going to start implementing this, or if you're already doing it, emphasize the fact and the need that you need to have a strong leadership supporting this. And equally important is necessary to really look at the foundations of doing the work in human experience. It is very strongly related to things that sometimes, if you're new to this, may look a little bit strange because they are not usually the skills we have learned throughout the years in human resources. So it's important to go out and start looking outside human resources. And Elliot already pointed out in his slides the importance to look at, I mean, in human resources, we are already adopting data and analytics, we are already adopting agility, but we need to really look beyond the fence. When we talk about human experience, customer experience is something that has been here for many years, and there's a lot that we can learn from them. So don't think that you need to do it only by yourself. There's a lot of expertise and knowledge that probably is already there in your own organization. It is just a question of tapping into it. So these are two fundamental pillars. And as Damon already explained, we're going to go a little bit deeper for the learning phase in a few minutes to really share some examples around that. So now I want to hand over to Martijn to talk about governance and strategy.
Thank you very much, Nina. So when we take a look at the learning phase, most of the organizations that are in that phase are their e-checks is recognized as an important concept, but it's not yet embedded into the organization's governance or the strategic planning process, right? So as you can see, there is curiosity, often experimentation, and early awareness, which is often driven by, I would say, a group of evangelists, as Nina was already talking about. You need that to create awareness, but it is not something that has been institutionalized, which is a really important thing. So this is the phase where often also the data and the data capture in terms of the governance is changing, where we are moving away from engagement data towards experience data, as Damon already mentioned, to make sure that we have the right data to be able to influence the right business leaders and to also get the buy-in from the leadership, to make sure that we also are able to get the data that we can prioritize the right things that create the best business impact, but also will make sure that we establish the credibility as an HX leader that we need to have. And so that's why the governance is really important. Last, what I want to say about that is the governance often within each X is, you could say, vertically distributed, which means that different parts of functions or teams have certain agency, whereas each X asks you to look at things horizontally, to look at things end to end. So how do you make sure that you have the right data?
Rare stamina. Okay, cool.
To be able, can everybody go on mute, please? Thanks. That you are able to actually say, okay, this data allows us now to understand from a horizontal point of view which prioritization we need to have. What is the portfolio we're looking at? So you're building slowly but surely a portfolio. And then last but not least, in terms of this element, you have the strategy. Now, strategically in the learning phase, as you have with the governance, HX doesn't have yet a unified or codified agenda. So the HX leader is really looking at, okay, so how do I find through the prioritization the right problems to solve, and how do I then build in terms of the future state the strategy to go there, and in this case also make sure that I in co-creation, take the different business leaders along that way. So it's really important about building that roadmap, showing that vision, because often the investment in EX is often opportunistic rather than planned. And as I already said, the data needs to shift from engagement really to operational and experience data. And so therefore, the strategic insights and analysis do not have the foundation yet to be able to build those kind of EX business cases. So to conclude, the focus in this phase is really about building awareness, creating the urgency, and then gaining the alignment. And I'll hand it over back now to Elliot.
Okay, I think Julie, you're going to set up the next phase. So take us through what we're going to do next. I think we want to go a little bit deeper.
Exactly. So if you advance to the slide that's coming next, you'll see that within each of these elements of the maturity model, there are some specific steps that can guide your activities or that you can use to figure out, exactly where are we? Rather than myself go through this, I'll go back to to Damon first, and we'll take it from top to bottom in terms of what we're really talking about in the learning phase for each of these elements.
Thanks, Julie. All right, so we'll take a few minutes here and focus on each of these two. So the one here on top, the impact on work. This is about, there's lots of sort of subcomponents here, but I think there's two important ones that we call out here in the model in this learning phase. And one is just the experience of work becomes more seamless for employees. So there's less user friction. The interactions they have with the organization are more intuitive, and employees become more empowered. So more self-service, more empowerment. Also, the key employee journeys, and importantly, the critical moments that matter for them are more cohesive, they're emotionally intelligent and personalized. And all of this has a way of really reducing friction in the day-to-day and providing a better experience. A second one is really around trust and transparency. And this is, when we talk about collecting employee feedback and acting on that feedback, this helps employees feel seen and heard and more valued, and it's more authentic and consistent in their experience. And that has a way of driving, all those great things we talked about earlier with engagement and satisfaction and trust. Also, leaders can start to make much more informed decisions based on data and feedback that comes from employees, their input and their feedback. So it's really two important components of the impact of work. So just as an example, I want to share about recently there was an opportunity where the organization, came to me and said, "Hey, we want to improve the experience of work here, go for it." And it's like, well, we have to kind of understand, well, what is the experience of work here? And so my team and I set out to do this pretty comprehensive qualitative study of the experience of work. And so we went to all the major sites around the globe. We held focus groups. We held one-on-one interviews. We pulled in all of the data and results from our, more traditional sort of engagement surveys and other qualitative sources that we had with our data. And we developed a really robust, 90-page experience report that really went into the nuts and bolts of, what was the experience that people were reporting to us? What were the highlights? What were some of the opportunities? And packaged all of this in a way that provided insights that got used for, across the business, across the functions, across different levels of leadership. And especially, it got a lot of attention when we got a new CEO and a new CHRO coming in, because it gave them a really big leg up on understanding, what is the experience of work. So those are all just an example of why it's important to conduct research and understand the experience of work so that we can jump in tactically and improve it at those moments where those opportunities are brought up. So the second one, impact on business, there are many subcomponents here as well. I think two that we call out here in the early stage of the model are around, attraction and retention. These are often important business metrics. And so, focusing on the experience, especially during recruitment and onboarding, can help elevate and increase the employer brand and the candidate quality. It can help reduce time to hire. It can also drive reduced turnover and just loss of, institutional knowledge in general, because these have a very high cost when your turnover is high. And even more specifically, reduce regrettable attrition of new hires and early career employees. These are typically higher risk groups that we can drive interventions for. The other big measurement that tends to come early on is productivity and performance. And so reduced, and we've talked about this a little bit, but reduced friction and blockers in the day-to-day experience of work. Reduce friction in those key employee journeys and those critical moments that matter. And that reduced friction can be in processes, in the tech, in the policies. All of those can be time wasters. So meaning that we can boost employee performance at scale, but without increasing workload. And that's really important. So really what it comes down to is, your employees can work smarter and not harder. And then when it comes to, new employees or new hires, they're productive faster and they'll have greater confidence, clarity, and autonomy to jump in and get the work done. So an example I have on this one is, onboarding. And the leadership of the organization was like, hey, we want you and your team to take a look at onboarding and, fix onboarding. Okay, great. What's the challenge there? Well, satisfaction is low. The numbers coming out of it are low. Time to productivity is also very high. And we're actually, like I mentioned, that tends to be a high risk group. Our attrition numbers, in the 2 years or less mark is much higher than we'd like it to be. So great. So we jumped in, and long story short, one of the first observations was even how onboarding was defined. It was just, in their mind, it was just that day one experience. We're like, wow, no, if we really think about this end to end and the journey that these new hires are taking, the journey they're on is to feel welcome and be ready to work at this organization. That starts with the offer and goes all the way, well past day one. And when you map that out and when you look at all the teams involved, there were over 15 teams that we uncovered that were involved in and interacted with this employee. So we brought all those teams together and we researched, we co-created, and started to co-deliver a much more intuitive and integrated experience that took a lot of the friction and the pain points out of that experience. And that doesn't happen overnight, but you can develop an experience-based roadmap that shows you how you can implement those changes over time in a much more integrated way. So just a couple quick examples. With that, I think I'm handing back to Nina again to talk about leadership and capabilities.
Thank you very much, Damon. And great examples, by the way, about the impact that you can have already at the learning phase. When it comes to leadership, I quickly mentioned before, it is extremely essential. If you really want to take this seriously in your own organization, it is extremely important to have someone who spearheads this on behalf of senior leaders so that you can really take it very seriously in the organization, right? And here's where we see that on the learning phase, having an active sponsorship is extremely essential. someone who's talking to their peers in terms of senior leadership, to showcase the first results. So the examples of the impact that Damon was just giving, it is extremely essential that are spread so that more people, more senior leaders, more parts of the organization see, understand, and endorse this work afterwards. What we see also is extremely important happening at this phase is an active communication, increasing the awareness of what human experience is all about. Someone who's actively sharing, but also role modeling, right? So that more and more people get contagious. And finally, one of the key things you need to secure when you are on the learning phase from leadership are resources. Your initial seed funding that can be, you don't need to really have huge investments, but at least you need to have a seed funding to start testing new ideas that come as a result of people working on human experience. And I have an example here from the time that I started a few years ago in ING Bank. I was knocking at the door of human resources. Unfortunately, I was not successful in convincing human resources to help me to focus on addressing things using an HX approach into the organization. So what I did instead is I went to the business. I went to the business and I went to a specific area that has really been suffering at that time, had been suffering at that time from poor engagement, poor performance, high attrition, and well, I had the opportunity to talk and convince a senior leader that we could do things differently in this case. That led to this senior executive, his name is Christopher, to really say, okay, you show me the way, you help me to understand how are we going to do this. Before we knew, we could mobilize more than 50 employees in this area who wanted to put their heads together to really understand what was the journey, what were the main gaps, and how could we address them with their help, with the help of the employees. He put on the resources, he really communicated how important it was, all of this. And fast forwarding 3 years later, we won the highest achievement that we could get at the bank, recognizing that this became the key revenue maker in the organization, high engagement, high performance, low attrition. And this means that we could actually get results. So talking about having a sponsor here, this sponsor, Christopher, mobilized other senior leaders. And more, the question started coming, not only from the business, from HR, sorry, but from the business, that this was something that we needed to do. So leadership is extremely important in this early phase. And the next one is capabilities. I already mentioned the importance of looking at capabilities outside your own area in human resources. And what we need to really think in terms of capabilities is how are you going to enable the first initial work? Most probably you will be testing, prototyping, experimenting in different areas, but you need to have the right capabilities to make this happen, right? So when you're enabling in this phase, you need to really make sure that you have the expertise. You may have it internally, you may need to bring it from outside so that everyone starts learning and understanding the key concepts, the methods, the frameworks that will help you to really address these in a proper way. In terms of adopting, you need to really make sure that you're not only focusing on the adoption of these new knowledge, skills, competencies within HR, but also with all the functions that are going to help you to deliver on the employee experience. And by that, I mean, you may need IT, you may need communications, you may need facilities, you name it. So here's where you start really creating that awareness and bringing and identifying people who can or will be interested in being part of this. And when we're talking really about growing, we're really talking about initially you may have in a small team or one person doing the work, but with the time you will need to really start identifying who else can become part of the team so that you can really spread the knowledge and expertise. in your company. And as an example, this is exactly how we did it in AkzoNobel. We took a few people. I started by myself. I ended up by having larger team, well, a bigger team, not a larger, but a bigger team working on this. And I brought people who were coming from a CX experience, from data analytics. Agility was also one of the core elements, customer centricity, you name it. We took a group of people, and what I did is the very first thing that I did is I put them into an intense program of 3 weeks to learn all the basic foundational concepts that you needed to have. And from there, great things started happening because they themselves got so energized and so curious, and they wanted to work this. So they started looking for opportunities to experiment across the organization. So this is what you can see in terms of capabilities when you are on the learning phase. To complement this, I want to hand over now to Martijn to talk about governance and strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina. All right, so looking at what governance means in the learning phase and doing a little bit more of a deep dive on that. One of the first things is really important is to establish ownership of those HX efforts. Full stop. Within HR is possible, or within a pilot team is also possible. From my experience, I don't like it when it's only within HR, because as you have already heard from me, I think, is that I believe that HX really looks at things horizontally. So again, it would cramp the style of that team. But when it comes to ownership, it's really important that that's established. As HX and EX is taking a flight and it's becoming more and more sexy, you often also see that that ownership is being fragmented in the organization. Now, to one hand, you can say, hey, that's great, because I've got a lot of people that basically take in and really believe that HX is the way forward. On the other hand, a real clear ownership defined and established is really important, especially in the learning phase. Because what's connected to that is the decision making. Because once you have established the ownership, you also need to look at, okay, and so how do we then take decisions on which pilots or initiatives do we take forward? Which ones are the important ones? So it's really important to have the ownership and also the decision making being very clear. And last but not least is also that if you want to be able to take those decisions, you need data, as we all know. So how do you make sure that you capture early on both employee feedback? And what I'm talking about is not engagement alone. What I'm talking about is experience data, as I already said at the beginning. What I mean with that is customer satisfaction score, as Damon already talked about, or the customer effort score, or qualitative feedback from how easy or how hard it is to do a certain task. And last but not least, because on one hand, you of course have the employee needs, you also need to understand the business needs. What does the business need? What is that combination, that great connect between those two, to make sure that on one hand, you have the right insights to understand what your employees need, but on the other hand also that you understand what the business needs. I'll give you a quick example of that. When I joined a financial services firm as their head of EX, there was a book of work of 60 projects, and it was across HR, IT, facilities. What I then did is I said to them, okay, this is all earmarked EX, great. Can you tell me if it's moving the needle? Do you have the data that tells me that actually these projects are moving the needle? And if not, let's then gather that data. Because if, as I am the ultimate owner, because people will look at me about this book of work, if you do not have that data and we can't really show that it's moving the needle, let's then make the decision to stop this project. All right, so and that was only done on the basis of data, of course. So we started capturing that data. We made sure that we had qualitative data. We made sure we also had a lot of experience data. And then we were able to really bring down that book of work. So as I said, ownership is really important. To be able to take the right decisions and to make those decisions, you need to have those insights in you need to have those insights to be able to take those decisions. Last but not least is about the strategy, of course, as we all know. And these two, of course, are connected, governance and strategy. I always say they go hand in hand. It's not a linear concept or a linear way, as, for example, a roadmap often is. The first thing is about the define. So what is your future state in terms of the HX vision? Where do you want to go? And always make sure it's anchored in solving the business problems. So really making sure that you understand those. And then not last but not least, but then to that is to also make sure that you align your, I always say, coalition of the willing, so your core leadership around the priorities. That can be a pilot priority, but it can also be a certain business case, really important. And that you then also make sure that you articulate very well what your expected outcomes are. Because only then you will make sure that you have clearly made sure that the leadership understands what they can expect, and also that you've laid out basically the way that you want to go there. And last but not least, which is definitely linked to also what Nina said, is only through that strategy, then once you've done the vision, you've got your support and you've got your sponsorship, you will then be able to also resource that and allocate the right ones with, on one hand, people, but also with tools, of course, expertise. Either you buy it, you build it, as Nina already mentioned also, or you borrow it. That's also something. And to make sure that you have certain early funding to test viability. Now, a quick example on that one is when I had to start up my team within the financial services organization. I am certified in design thinking, service design, all of that. Nonetheless, I also had other things to do, making sure that people, that the core leadership was aligned and all of that. So I couldn't copy myself, right? So what I did is I went into the organization and actually found at Asset Management a service design organization that was more than happy to help me in bringing this capability, mindset, and expertise to my team. And so I made sure that they had every day, they had a 1 hour or 2 hours session, and then during the week they had a coaching with one of those experts, just to make sure, as I think Nina also mentioned, to make sure that people gather it, they become enthusiastic, but also that they understand that these capabilities are a different kind of capability. If you've never built a prototype, presented it, and got it shredded to the core, then you and felt that pain, then in my opinion, you can't really say to yourself that you really understand service design or design thinking, because you have to go through the motions. You have to do the 10,000 hours. So just I hope that that made a little bit clear about what governance is and strategy. And I'll hand it over now to Julie. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Martijn. I see one question, and I think we have time to answer it. It's related a bit, Martijn, to what you were talking about, which is under governance, what evidence do we have that something has changed and that it's changing in a positive direction, and are we willing to abandon it? Many of us have measurement strategies in large companies that are centered around engagement surveys and follow up to an engagement survey. Damon, how might you talk to Jason's question here about how measurement strategies and metrics changed in your experience as you began the learning phase and then moved into doing and being in your organization?
Yeah, happy to. And it's good to see Jason here. I actually know Jason really well. Yeah, this is a very important question. And, in the model, we do talk about measurement quite a bit here in the governance section. We think it's important to have your leadership and those that are sort of steering the HX strategy to really have the right data to make quality data-informed decisions. However, what this often means in our organizations, we usually find that the teams and the divisions, the orgs, they're measuring things, but they're often measuring the wrong things. So coming in and helping these organizations understand what experience metrics are, how to understand what are the right qualitative and quantitative metrics to measure and understand, and which measurements aren't serving us, which are, I like to call these like the pat on the back metrics. Like here's a quick example, like, oh, we had, 80% of people click on this email, about this new thing that we launched, this new offering that we launched to the employees. Well, okay, that's an interesting indicator. However, if the outcome we're trying to achieve is that they're actually adopting and using and applying this thing that we launched, that's what we need to be measuring. And so that's just a tiny example, but as we get into the journey work and the moments that matter and all these kinds of things, we have a whole framework of measurements that we can apply to help better understand, how are people actually using, engaging, and leveraging, important things at very specific moments in the journey or at those moments that matter. But it's important to really transform the organization to how to measure experience properly and in a way that allows us to tie it to tangible business results.
Thank you, Damon. That's terrific. Elliot, I think we wanted to just take another peek at the overall model before we move forward, correct? So we've seen a bit of detail, very valuable examples about what all of these elements look like at the learning phase. A couple of thoughts about the model itself, though. I think you can notice, of course, that these things are interrelated and that they can create a flywheel effect on impact on work and impact on business. So as we begin measuring the things that really matter, as we begin getting strong governance and good advocacy, it helps us to get better results, and getting better results helps us to get more leaders involved, more people who are curious about the capabilities. So these things are most certainly interrelated and complement one another. We are going to take a break in just a little bit, but before we do, I'm going to ask Elliot if you can turn to the slide just after the detail that we've just been going through. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to take a break, and we're going to leave this break model, this break sheet up for you. And when we return, we're going to go into breakout models. So just drawing your attention to some dates you'll want to save so that you continue learning with and providing input to this maturity model. We have boot camps coming up in New York City and London and Zurich. And in those boot camps, you'll actually begin building some of those capabilities that Nina was describing. After the break, we're going to have some conversations in some breakout rooms using mural boards so that we can actually type in our questions and see what people are curious about.
There we go. We thought that there's multiple models out there. This isn't the only one, but what we talked about was sort of the appreciation for the practicality and the sort of the tactical nature of this model. And that's one thing we were really hoping to do, is make this more tangible and usable in the day-to-day for HX teams and HX leaders. So it was good to hear that. The other thing that we had a good chat about was, when we talk about journeys or jobs to be done, shifting from, the traditional approach to personas by role of like manager, leader, employee, but instead into more attitudinal based personas or archetypes, like, designing for, the eager beaver employee that's engaged and wants to use the thing you're talking about, to those that might be a little more ambivalent, or even the naysayers. So the ones that, you really have to convince, and making those kinds of design choices and interventions in your journeys and moments. So it's a way of really maturing and elevating your practice of persona. So we talked about that, which I thought was pretty interesting. Group two. Who had group two?
Yeah,
Me?
I had group two. Let me jump into it. We had a lot of input, but we could only discuss a couple of things. So that was what happened in our group. But the first one was if someone wants to embark in HX as, you know, the way of working or something that they want to explore, what are the capabilities needed to do that? And we had an interesting discussion in terms of, okay, what are the things you need to learn? And it was, what can you have already within HR? For example, facilitation skills and the understanding about the different areas on the journey of the employees. But what do you need to acquire from outside? So that was a really very good, interesting conversation around that. And the second topic that we had was how would you introduce this maturity model within your own organization? And the distinctions that in what would be, if it will be easier to introduce in a, you know, in a startup or medium-sized company versus a corporate. And we just had a little bit of a debate around that. There was a lot of additional input that is captured on the post-its, very good. But the last point that we were addressing was how can this help to recruit new people? That was a very interesting one that we said, well, let's probably bring it if we have time in this group, because we didn't have time to cover.
All right, then group three, I think, is the last one. So we had a couple of conversations. First one was very similar to Damon, what he said about the model, and the group find it easy to apply, also to be able to connect it to change and change management initiatives, and there's a certain familiarity with it. I also asked the group, if you were able to change the operating model of HR, what would you do? Looking also at this model. The group was coming with the idea of having marketing or having personas being used within HR constantly, so having the user at the center, and having less reliance on, in this case, COEs and senior experts, but really having that user at the center. The other thing was that within the group was that they were missing the progression. So let's be clear also to the rest of for the whole group, this is just phase one. So you have learning, doing, and being. So there's definitely a progression. And the second webinar, we're going to go into phase two. So I would say go for that. And last but not least, I want to give Deborah also quickly the opportunity to say something about her insight.
I think the insight that I gained from participating is that there are a group of people globally that are interested in working on this, and it's great to have that network from both a local perspective. Iris is based out of the town that my company is based out of. I work virtually, but I'm actually going to be on site in the town that she's in on Monday, so we might connect with each other. And then globally, I think it's great, the global network. So thank you, Martijn.
Thank you very much, Deborah. And I think I'm going to give it back now to Julie.
Are there any other questions that people have that you'd like to discuss in the broader group that might not have come up yet? I want to make sure we address some of your first questions around phase one, the learning phase.
Well, the one that I share already, Julie, about how could we use these for recruitment purposes? That's a very interesting one to explore and have a conversation with this group.
Thank you, Carmen.
Julie, Tiago here. Good morning. For me, you know, most of my life been on the life sciences space, on big, large pharmaceuticals. And I had a 2-year stint in the tech space. And what I've learned is that it's way easier to actually get into these thinking and practice on the tech space, because that's kind of how they operate already. Yeah. But going back to more traditional cultures, it's really challenging, and it's step by step and use case by use case. So I wonder if we could, invest a little bit of time talking about how to break into the more traditional spaces with this toolkit and mindset.
Great question.
I love that, Tiago. In the group that Nina was leading, we had some discussion around that and around the fact that this maturity model describes some of the elements of moving to a greater level of maturity where human-centered design is concerned. When we are talking about breaking into and getting people curious about this approach, we wouldn't be marching them through that model. In fact, we would start much more simply, which are, what's happening with our strategy? What are some of the problems we're wanting to solve? And looking for leaders, senior level leaders in particular, who by instinct are very human-centered and who have an important problem to solve, and then talking with them about how this approach can help them get there. Nina, I'd love for you to add to that if you would, please.
Yeah, so what we said is I would never show this maturity model when I start with someone on the work. Definitely that will scare them to death. What you want to do is actually indeed dig in with the data that you may have in HR to dig in what are the areas that really are, where engagement scores very low, what parts of the business do have the lowest scores. And if you have a senior leader who is really focused on that and cares about people, like the example I gave at the very beginning, you may find opportunities to start really talking about how do we address those issues, those challenges in a different way. And that's what you want to get. You want to get the attention because they care about people, they have an issue, they have a challenge, and you want to address that. And the trick is to tell them and to share with them that there is a new approach, that it doesn't imply that they as senior leaders need to solve it all, or that human resources need to solve it all, but that there is a different approach in where you can bring people together, you can bring the employees, and you can start working and addressing those issues. I have seen this working, and there is much more openness to start really talking about it and to start really defeating the traditional old, rigid way of doing things in a company.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this one because it came up in our group as well. Jason was describing how he's a new HX leader coming into an org for the first time. They've never had this capability before. And I think a lot of us have found ourselves in that situation. And, that's an important part of this early phase of the model, and especially the swim lanes of leadership and governance. And so if you actually read what is on the chart, it's talking about showing and proving early value of this HX approach in a really light way. So we talk about identifying a place to run a prototype or two where you can jump in, understand a business need or business problem, do a prototype. And even if you don't have a team yet, pulling these kinds of UX, CX resources from other parts of the business or the other, parts of the functions. It could be marketing, communications, for example, but pulling together a little SWAT team to do a prototype, to do a pilot, to show the value of this approach, to show the transformational effect that this work can have if it's done right and done well. And those are the early nuggets you can get to get a lot of sponsorship, a lot of buy-in. And honestly, the more of that you can do, for those leaders that get those kind of great results in the end, you're going to have people knocking on your door saying, I want some of that. I want to be a part of that. How do I get this too? And so I think that's a great way to use this early part of the model to start to influence and build sponsorship with your leaders and stakeholders.
Yeah, and maybe if I could build on Damon's comment, and I made this comment in my group, but I'm actually surprised there are many organizations that don't have like change frameworks or leadership frameworks.
Yeah.
This is an easy substitute, right, for you to kind of get traction in different areas. So you don't have to introduce it as like, this is the human-centered way to do it. You can align it to, oh, we need to drive a change effort over here. Here's how we use it. Or you know what, we need to build leadership capability. So there's like a backdoor way also that you can bring it in. And that kind of gives you, Damon, to your point, like a test case to build upon, but it's linked to like something that's already been identified as a need that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And really the intent there is meet the organization where they are.
Mhm.
Don't come in and talk about all these new terms and all these new frameworks and models, like meet them where they are and kind of show the value and start to introduce more of the details over time.
Get them talking about, I totally agree. Use the language the business uses for things to describe this and hook into things that they say are critical issues they're trying to solve for. Sometimes when we've gotten started working with pharma organizations, and I worked at Pfizer, Novartis, and several pharma companies in my past life, I like to bring in the analogy of how they do things in their business, right? They do early stage research, target identification, develop proof of concept. They do the exact same things in research that we try to teach in terms of identifying and understanding what already works, how science, how molecules behave. And then as you understand that, you map it, synthesize it, prioritize it, and then do 3 rounds of testing in development and do user testing. So it's the same exact idea. So you could explain to a pharma using the same language they use exactly how this works. Or if you're doing product development for a tech company, how do they develop and test software? It's the same idea, right? So these concepts are not just out of thin air. They're out there already in organizations. So if we can grab a hold of their language and explain it, that really helps. Love
Just
the idea.
to add to that, what you're saying there, Elliot, is what really worked for me is when you want to come close to the business. I love the concept of willingness to pay, and it's very simple. You basically do interviews with HRBPs and business leaders, and you ask them, what budget would you allocate to reduce the time to deploy by 20%? Then suddenly they are going, and you use the HCDs, you use those principles, of course, but you talk their bit, you talk their language, and we often forget that willingness to pay internally is really important. What is a function? What is an HRBP? What's a business leader willing to pay for you to solve their business problems?
Yeah.
Great concept.
Mhm.
All right. So I just want to maybe close off and we've got I want to be conscious of time and people moving on to the next meetings, but just want to thank everybody for being part of this and just want to talk for a few seconds about where we go next with this. So we did ask for volunteers to do some further testing with us, and we would love to be able to think about where we go next with this. So thinking of some potential applications, we're thinking about helping organizations, those doing consulting, those doing CX work, whatever, understand with their client organizations, where are we now and what do we want to do? So an assessment could be one outcome of this, or a roadmap. What steps do we want to take? We've already done with a few organizations some work like this where we take a day with their team of people and say, let's understand from others who have done this, who are farther along, what have they done? What have they learned from? And let's try one of these tools and see how the insights are different, how it works to give us some understanding, and then use the roadmap as some milestones and make some decisions. What do we want to do this year, next year, et cetera, and take this stepwise. You can also use it to build internal capability, know how to coach on a transformation, and know how and where to provide support. So for the things that you're doing internally, or if you're an external coach, and really think about from a systemic approach how to help the organization be more data driven. These are just some initial ideas that we've come up with. We'd love to hear from you on what you think would be some potential applications of this. We're preparing to, we want to get this ready to launch in the market in the next 2 months. So we're going to take the feedback that we heard today, do some further user testing, write about it. Our goal is even to have a book where we can bring in all sorts of examples and cases and how we do this. And then finally, where you can learn some more about this, we'll do part 2. So please do join us on June 11th, where we'll talk about the later phases of doing and being. And we're also going to be doing a series of boot camps where we teach some of the skills and also how to integrate this and coach you through how you're working with your organizations or clients. We have a 2-day workshop that teaches this as a certification and something you can try out for your organization if this is something you want to do for more people inside your company. We'll do New York City on the 4th and 5th of June, 2nd and 3rd of September in London, and then Zurich on the 18th and 19th of September. And just to give you kind of an idea of how this works, the model that we use is just open source from human-centered design. So going from insights to mapping to prioritization and then solutions using this 3-diamond approach borrowed from human-centered design. And in the first phase, what we do is we create personas, show you how to gather insights and make some decisions and how to create personas, how to create a research wall and set up a research strategy. In the second phase, we walk through how to do mapping, and we do a mapping exercise with real live colleagues. In the boot camps, we're going to take a humanitarian organization, because we always like to have real live people, and we'll focus on how to improve the onboarding journey of volunteers for a humanitarian organization and involve those people in defining for us their experience and mapping those priorities for them, the moments that matter. And then the third stage or final phase, the participants will create a prototype and a storyboard and pitch that back to the original end users with some very specific solutions. So it's taking a focused journey, learning how to apply the tools and methods in human-centered design, talking about how to do this systemically in an organization with some of these elements of the maturity model, and helping you get started in your organization in how you can do this or with your clients. But that's the sense of the boot camps. You get a facilitation guide, you get a certification. That's the boot camp. And that's it. So that takes us to the end. I will share also some of our favorite places where we've learned, the people that have inspired us. Organizations I would recommend are the Service Design Network, anything done by Mark Stickdorn and Smapley. Those guys do some really interesting work on journey management and journey operations. And Jared Spool, if you were part of our summit in November, Jared is one of the best teachers, has a bricks and mortar school on UX. All of these people have fantastic YouTube channels. And here are some of our favorite books, highlighted especially in yellow, the ones that we would recommend first. But just really appreciate all of you joining us today. Hope you had a fun time and look forward to seeing you in 4 weeks. Thanks again.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.